I'm Dr. Mark Hyman, and this is a place for conversations that matter. And today I'm bringing you an important conversation with Calley Means, a former big food and big pharma consultant who's now pulling back the veil on corrupt industry practices and ringing the warning bell about how our health is being destroyed by these insidious practices. Calley is the founder of TrueMed, a company that enables tax-free spending on food and exercise. He's also the co-author with his sister of Good Energy, the surprising connection between metabolism and Limitless Health, which is coming out later this year and is now available for pre-order. Earlier in his career, Calley was a consultant for food and pharma companies and is now exposing practices that they use to weaponize our institutions of trust. In the past year, he's met with 50 members of Congress and presidential candidates advocating policies to combat the corruption of the pharma and food industry. He's also a graduate of Stanford and Harvard Business School. Now, we open our conversation discussing how Calley came to understand the incredible influence that pharmaceutical and food industries have over all of our major institutions, everything from the media to academic institutions to civil rights groups, medical organizations, policymakers, and more. And Calley shares the number one most egregious thing he witnessed inside of one of America's largest think tanks, the Heritage Foundation. Industry funding of scientific research is a huge issue with major implications for our health. And Calley and I discuss the ins and outs of this topic in great detail. We talk about how at the end of the day, our ill health is the primary profit driver for the very system that is keeping us unwell. We also get into the obesity crisis and how the newly popularized weight loss drug Ozempic is being used not only among adults, but now for children as well. This not only raises huge concerns for the physical health of our nation's kids, but there's a very real connection to the increase in mental health issues among our nation's children and even our national security. ADD, learning and disabilities, anxiety, depression in kids and adults are all on the rise. Calley connects the dots on how industry corruption is largely to blame for all of this. While these are huge issues, the hopeful news is that given the right leadership, there are potential immediate fixes that are not difficult to implement. Calley outlines relatively simple ways we can back ourselves out of this mess. We cover everything from pharmaceutical advertising on television to how the food industry markets to children, and even what America can learn from the fall of the Roman Empire. And now let's dive into my conversation with Calley Means. So welcome back to the podcast, Calley. It's great to have you back.
Oh, pumped to be here, Mark.
Yeah, well, we have so much in common about how we think about our food system. And we came at it from totally different perspectives. I came at it as a physician, seeing what was happening to my patients because of the food they're eating, and then started to expand my lens to look at the entire food system and its impact across all the sectors that we care about. Obviously, the impact on chronic disease, its economic burden, where we spend over $4.3 trillion on healthcare, most of it on preventable chronic disease, the impact on our environment, the degradation of our environment from the use of agricultural chemicals, climate change impact by loss of soil, the impact on military readiness because kids are not fit to fight anymore and 70% get rejected. Our academic performance is going down. We're 30th and plus in the world in math and reading. It's going down because our kids are cognitively impaired because of the food they're eating. We're seeing increases in violence, aggression, divisiveness, polarization in society, which is now clearly linked to food. Our mental health crisis linked to food. I mean, it just goes on, and even health disparities, social justice issues. And I came at it, as I expanded my lens, I began to see this, and I wrote my book, Food Fix, which I think you had read, and I think you started in a very different place, which was at the Heritage Foundation as basically someone who was thinking about how to address some of our social and political and economic issues through a think tank. And so you worked in this think tank, you were a lobbyist, you were a consultant, and you got the inside scoop on a lot of what was going on around our food system. And you began to see that it was troubling you from a moral perspective, and that your moral compass started to kind of go, wait a minute, this is not quite what we should be doing. And through that lens, you've sort of begun to understand how our food system is something that is really broken, how it really is driving so much of what's wrong with our society, and how it really needs to change. And so you've been an advocate. You've been out there in the media. You're on news shows. You're on podcasts. You're talking about this. You started a company to actually try to help people access their own health and well-being through their health savings and FSA accounts, which are allowing people to use that money to up their wellness. And so I want to kind of have you unpack, what was it like being on the inside of the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, and what was happening in there as you were working with big food companies and they were working with you to try to shape what was happening on a political level?
The word that comes to mind and the overarching goal is rigging institutions of trust.
Rigging institutions
of trust. So you have a company, you have an interest. Who are their stakeholders? Their stakeholders are consumers. Obviously you want to impact what they think. You want to impact the media, which has a big impact. You want to impact government leaders. You want to impact research. You want to impact groups like civil rights groups and other medical groups that people trust. So you want to, as a company in the United States that's trying to get something accomplished, you want to impact all of those groups. And the truth is, the pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare industry at large is the largest funder of government. It's the largest funder of think tanks. It's the largest funder of academic research. It's the largest funder of news funding. It's 50% of news funding. So the objective, and
so they basically infiltrated every.
They're the largest funder of every single institute. They're the largest funder of medical groups. They're the largest funder of civil rights groups, actually, the NAACP. Yeah. So every group that we hold sacrosanct, Harvard, the NIH is highly, the FDA, as you've pointed out, is more than 50% directly funded by the pharmaceutical industry. And then food's not far behind. So you literally have the core institutions that set our culture, that set the guidelines. Their bills are paid by pharma. And as a consultant for these industries, that's just the simple question. And these are not really geniuses working at these consulting companies or for the pharmaceutical companies. It's actually very simple. It's like, how do we get money to the right people? How do we fund research? How do we fund the medical groups? How do we fund the politicians themselves? Yeah. And then the healthcare industry is the largest. I mean, that's 5 times more money spent by them on lobbying and public affairs than the oil industry. Food is not far behind. And I got to admit, Mark, and I'm ashamed to say it, it took me many, many years. It took more than a decade out of the swamp to really put all the pieces together. But
you were a swamp creature, Calley?
I'm a reformed swamp creature and have been out for more than a decade, working to start companies. But looking back in retrospect, it's very interesting and I think very telling that you have one meeting, in the morning with the pharmaceutical and the healthcare industry, and the next, in the afternoon, you're meeting with the food industry. Those are the two biggest spenders in DC. People on both sides of the aisle, go into consulting, go into lobbying, and they're working inevitably for those two industries. Healthcare is the one area in the United States where there's no ideology. Yeah. I mean, this is where Elizabeth Warren is aggressively supporting tax cuts. Yeah. It's the only industry because of, Massachusetts, it's totally bought off by the healthcare industry. Yeah. She's actually aggressively fighting for tax cuts. That's insane. It's where, basically Republicans are fighting for socialism, and total corporate cronyism. So you don't have any ideology. I mean, famously, Obamacare was created by the Heritage Foundation. Literally, that's off the shelf Romney Care. It was originally the Heritage Foundation actually created it. When the Republicans under Trump had a chance to repeal, as they've been saying for 8 years, they didn't have a plan. Yeah. They literally didn't have a bill. There's no ideology in healthcare. This is actually a bipartisan thing where they're all paralyzed and all bought off.
So what was the most egregious thing that you saw sitting inside the Heritage Foundation that kind of made you wake up to the fact that there's a problem? They were trying to influence social groups, right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the most alarming thing I saw, again, in retrospect, is the complete washing hands of why people are getting sick. And that's because of food. So actually how tied
So they knew it, but they just didn't care, and they wanted to push policies that promoted more foods that made people sicker and sicker?
Well, I think it's obvious if you really step back, the biggest issue in the country right now is that we're all getting sicker, fatter, more depressed, more infertile. Just to go over the stats that I think our eyes can gloss over the stats, but more than 25% of young adults having prediabetes, 20% of teens having fatty liver disease, 50% of teens now being overweight or obese, and then that going to close to 80% now overweight or obese for adults. I mean, truly, this is the biggest issue in the country. But
it's US, so incredible, Calley, that it's not part of our political discourse. No. When you hear people campaigning, when you hear debates on the debate stage, when you hear the news reports about what's wrong with our country or what's going on, This was absent from the conversation. It's just so striking to me.
Yeah, the most striking thing is that when you really, and again, Mark, I'm coming from a different direction than a lot of people you talk to, and I'm coming from a swamp creature, but I don't think it's that complicated that we're getting sicker because of food. Mm-hmm. And the most shocking thing, and I think the most appalling thing that's happening, is not only is the medical system not ringing the alarm bell about food, not only is the dean of Harvard Med School or the head of the NIH not standing before Congress saying, let's not give kids sugar. Let's at least not recommend it like the USDA does. They're actually in bed with the food companies. Yeah. The most shocking thing I saw is the Heritage Foundation taking money from Coca-Cola to say that it's, immoral and against conservative principles to not, give poor kids Coke. Right. The American Diabetes Association taking money from Coke.
Yeah.
Medical groups that should be fighting against this liquid sugar that's causing prediabetes and diabetes among kids. Yeah. They're taking money. So it's actually the direct ties, as you pointed out, of nutrition schools taking 11 times more money from processed food companies than they take from the NIH.
Yeah.
For
research,
they're the lifeblood.
The food industry basically funds almost 12 times as much research dollar-wise as the NIH in food and nutrition, and those studies are 8 to 50 times more likely to show a positive result. In other words, if you're studying dairy and you're funded by the Dairy Council, you're going to find it's a great sports drink, it's healthy for you, and we should be recommending it. And yet independent science doesn't show that.
I was just at Stanford Med School with my sister a week ago. You walk into where students learn and there's a Coke machine.
Yeah.
And I actually when I was working for Coke, we really tried, and it was a concerted effort to funnel monies and sponsor hospitals, and hospitals took that money.
Yeah.
It is like drug rehab clinics taking money from heroin makers. It's like these hospitals are full of people with metabolic conditions. Yeah. That's what's overflowing our hospitals. And the fact that
it's like having a heroin dispenser in a rehab center.
Exactly. The hospitals, 85% of costs, 85% roughly of deaths are tied to preventable foodborne metabolic conditions. And the strategy working for the food companies, how do we funnel money to the pharmaceutical and healthcare industries? And they take that money, and they're silent on why we're getting sick. So that's really I believe the biggest issue in the world that we need to unpeel.
It's really insidious. The food industry, and not including the pharma industry, is the biggest industry on the planet. Ag, big fast food, processed food companies. It's about $16 trillion globally. It employs more people than any industry. And it again is driving so much of the problems. I just got back from Africa, and I visited the Maasai, and I was shocked to see, in this village where they don't have any water, they don't have electricity, there was just a giant truck full of Coca-Cola and Fanta, which is a Coke product, pulled up. Within minutes, all these tribal people in really traditional tribal dress, who were living on the milk, meat, and blood of their cows for their diet, were just sucking back these Cokes, and literally the whole thing emptied out, and the bottles were stacked up and within minutes. And I was just shocked. And I said to the chief, I said, does this truck come often? He's like, yeah, it comes every day like this. I said, you understand that the sugar is not good for you and that it may cause diabetes? He says, really? I said, yeah. He says, well, that's amazing, because most of our population is now dying of diabetes. And this is the Maasai tribes who, really never had exposure to this, and where you can't even get running water, you can get Coca-Cola. And I think this is part of the problem. It's so insidious. And as I began to sort of unpack this myself and look at the cause, because as a functional medicine doctor, I'm very interested in what's the cause, what's the root cause, and then what's the cause of the cause of the cause. And I began to look at the way the food industry operated, and why my patients were eating this stuff, and why the population at large was so sick. And I realized it was really a multifaceted, coordinated, very detailed strategy. It wasn't something random. One, like you said, nutrition industry funds, or the food industry, I'll say, I don't call it nutrition industry, because there's not much nutrition in there, funds 12 times as much research as the NIH. Two, they co-opt social groups and corporate responsibilities. As you mentioned, they fund the NAACP. I remember, being down at the King Center in Atlanta with Bernice King, and and we wanted to show the movie Fed Up, which talked about childhood obesity. And she was very inspired about it and wanted to show the movie there. And we had it scheduled. And just a few days before the screening of the movie, we were called and said, no, we can't show the movie there. I'm like, why? Well, Coca-Cola funds the King Center in Atlanta. They fund Morehouse College and they fund Spelman College. Morehouse, Spelman are black colleges in Atlanta. Spelman College is a female black college. 50% of the entering class of 18-year-olds have a chronic disease, either diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and all over the campus are Coca-Cola machines. They also not only co-op social groups, but they create friend groups, things like the American Council on Science and Health, which sound great, or Crop Life, or various kinds of things that have great sounding names, but are actually controlled and funded by food, pharma, big ag. And they actually recommend things like pesticides are good for you and trans fats are okay and smoking is not bad. And they're calling out all these issues that are making them seem like they're a high level scientific organization. And as you said, they also there's also incredible lobbying, like, just on one bill, on the GMO labeling bill a number of years ago, there was $192 million spent on this one bill. The Farm Bill has $500 million in lobbying spent on just one bill, which I shouldn't really call it a farm bill. It's mostly the food bill. Right. And so we have all these concerted efforts and co-opting of different aspects that are really problematic and that are creating a kind of almost a narcotized population that doesn't realize this is happening and is co-opted the government. I mean, I think there are good people in government. You and I have been in Washington last year, and I've been working on the Food Fix campaign, my nonprofit, to try to address these issues through policy change. And people are getting it. And I've been meeting with, literally well over 100 plus members of Senate and Congress and the White House and various health departments. And to a person, nobody is seeing this as not a problem. They don't quite understand it. Their educational level is pretty low. One guy I met with, really sweet guy who was a congressman, and he was like, lost 25 pounds. I did a talk earlier. I went into a group of congressmen and he read my book and he followed the program. He looked so much better. And we had a drink after work one day. He's like, this is so great. I feel so good. I said, great. Why don't we do a sugar detox for Congress? Yeah. And he's like, I love the idea, but I'm on the candy caucus. I'm on the candy caucus because my district has a lot of candy makers, so I can't really do it. That is sort of a story that I think that underscores the problem we see in Washington and why we're so screwed. And I think what I'm so happy about with what you're doing is you're bringing to light across so many different channels of media, social media, television, these issues, and now people are starting to listen, and you're getting called up on major news shows and major programs, or the Russell Brand or Fox News or other media outlets that are able to actually start to pay attention to this issue. So I'm just really grateful for you. What have you found as you've gone out and start to kind of hammer these messages that you are so good at articulating?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things, because I've been in dozens of conversations behind closed doors with members of Congress. And I think the question I'm really wondering, and I think probably a lot of people are, is like, why is it the way it is? And I actually ask that to people. Yeah. And you hit on this a little bit, but I really dig into that because, as you've seen, bipartisan, almost to a person, people are concerned about this issue. People have kids go into a classroom and see that there's clearly something wrong happening in America. I think there's an innate sense that our food is compromised and clearly something bad is happening. So it's a couple things. I think actually, number one, it just goes to this corruption and the rigging of the institutions of trust. What I hear time and time again from members of Congress is that they came in and aren't health experts, right? They were military guys, or they were, focused on farming or something, some small issue. They can't comprehend the large scale scope of health. And then they say every single day, people come into their office, lobbyists, with new studies saying GMOs are good, new studies saying glyphosate is fine, new studies saying aspartame is fine, new studies saying, recently the USDA, a large scale study that was brought all around the halls of Congress saying 91% diet of ultra processed food is perfectly healthy.
Yeah.
The USDA literally just created that study.
Yeah.
So these studies are coming again and again relentlessly.
And that contradicts so much other independent research. Like
Exactly. You recently had a big debate on aspartame. I think it's 91% of the studies funded by industry show it's fine, and then 100% of the studies that are truly independent, which is a small portion of the studies, show it's very harmful.
Correct.
That's been for decades. So these members of Congress, to a person, are saying again and again and again, it's just relentless study after study after study. There were 50,000 nutrition studies created in just the past 2 years, 50,000 peer-reviewed nutrition studies. My opinion is that the vast majority of those studies are nothing more than PR research for processed food. You don't need studies saying that organic broccoli or pasture-raised meat, there's not